Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video, going to be sharing with you my thoughts on the most recent raid tier for Final Fantasy XIV, Eden's Gate Savage, our first raid tier of the Shadowbringers expansion pack. Now, I get requests for videos like this all the time, whether it be Mondays with Mr. Happy, live on the Twitch stream. People just want to know what I think, so that's what this video is going to be. I do these kind of videos without a script, so they tend to go on a little bit longer. Not that anyone who watches my content is ever surprised when that happens. So before I actually share my thoughts on this raid tier, I've had a lot of new viewers on the channel. For those of you who are new to the channel with Shadowbringers, welcome. I figured it would probably be good if I actually provided a bit of my history with raiding in Final Fantasy XIV for those who are newer, so they understand kind of where my perspective is coming from. And honestly, I've got a pretty mixed perspective when it comes to Final Fantasy XIV. I've done really hardcore world progression level raiding. First coil, second coil, Gordius is a big one. Sigmascape, Weapons Refrain, Alphascape, really hardcore raid hours and progression going into those specific tiers. But I've also more casually approached things. While I did beat Second Coil Savage at its relevant item level, I didn't do it until after Final Coil had been out. And Final Coil, I didn't even have a static fort going in. Midas, I practically didn't beat till Creator came out, and Creator just casually approached it. So I've got all sorts of experience, and I try to mix those things in when I'm looking at these encounters. And with that, I gotta say, I'm pretty happy with this raid tier overall. There's things we gotta get into specifically, so just know that I generally enjoyed this raid tier, and I think it's probably one of the most balanced raid tiers that we've had in Final Fantasy XIV, at least from a creator difficulty level, which is kind of what this raid tier is related to. For those who are newer, creator was like when they finally got the raid tier kind of more approachable by, I'd say, more than 1% of the community. So since then, that's kind of what we've used to compare it to. And this was, I think, a stellar example of that raid tier, probably the best example of that difficulty since Creator itself. So we're going to do this fight by fight, because every fight kind of has to be approached in a different way with Final Fantasy XIV. The first fight's always the intro fight. You could almost compare it to either equal to or just above an extreme primal. Then the second fight kicks things up a notch, but is usually interchangeable with the first fight in terms of difficulty. Not how it actually worked out in this raid tier at all. And then the third and fourth fight are usually the big difficulty and somewhat gear spikes for the earlier weeks, where people who may not have mastered their job or may not be playing at a very high level are going to take their time to progress on, and that's perfectly okay. So let's start with the first fight for Eden's Gate Savage, and that's going to be Eden Prime, much to everyone's surprise, fighting a Prime right off the bat after all the raid tiers we've had in the past. And this fight for me was on a higher scale when it came to first fights in the various raid tiers. So these are usually, again, much more approachable to extreme primal content. There's very basic things you need to be able to get right. Usually the healing demand is a little bit higher, and the DPS checks are tighter. They try to tighten those things up for Savage overall. But if you were able to do the EX Primals, then this should feel like a relevant stepping stone into the rest of the raid tier, and I think they nailed that pretty on the ball. One of my favorite first fights across all of the Savage raid tiers, at least going from that creator difficulty we spoke about earlier, is actually the boss from the previous raid tier, the previous Savage raid tier of Alphascape in Stormblood. Chaos was an encounter where the first phase was, I guess, between one of two phases, and the second phase would just do whatever the first phase didn't do. So you could essentially practice the whole fight in the very beginning, and then there was an interim phase and a finale that you had to kind of know how to approach in the earlier weeks when you were kind of racing against the Enrage, or if your group had just messed up a bunch and had really low DPS. Now, Eden Prime actually kind of exemplifies a little bit of Stormblood raiding in looking at that design, where the second half of the fight is very similar to the first half of the fight. You do learn some very, very important things. However, Eden Prime for me was also a shining example of what they don't want to do in this expansion with raiding, in that while the second phase does have a point where it repeats, it makes minor changes, makes you change things around a little bit, and also gives you brand new mechanics to actually learn and practice in the form of Paradise Regained. So it's a very simple fight to understand. If you understood normal mode, then it helps a lot with this one. But then when the Savage parts actually kick in, they feel relevant. It feels like, okay, I do need to just completely change my way of thinking about this specific mechanic. And it's also very intuitive to figure out. It doesn't take very long to figure out that the way you did the first phase is very similar to normal mode. But then when you go into the second phase, you notice that you tried to treat them exactly the same and it didn't work. So it becomes very quick to understand that, well, it's probably the reverse, because if they got hit and they got physical vulns on the tanks with the lasers, the first mechanic you see, then there's probably something else happening here. They can't either be hit by these alone, or they need to not be hit by them first. So it's a very simple deduction process, but it's not necessarily simple for the average player. You know, the average player is going to look at that and just see, I died, which is great. There's a learning process there. And that's kind of the thing that the first raid tier in an expansion should be teaching you while you're still kind of familiarizing yourself with the job and with the gameplay. And for people who are new to the game with the expansion, their first experience with raiding, it's a great lesson in ways to look for things when you're actually progressing in raiding. And I've gotten a request to do a video like that. How do you recognize those things? And expect it soon, because I think it's actually a very interesting discussion to have with Final Fantasy XIV. So overall, Eden Prime, nothing spectacular, but adequately challenging and a very good introduction for raiding for people who are new to Final Fantasy XIV. Just a step up over the EX Primals with a tighter DPS check, tighter heal check, and a slightly tighter mechanical check, but nothing too crazy. Things start to change a little bit when you get into the second fight. Now, Voidwalker is actually probably the biggest topic to talk about with the Eden's Gate Savage raid tier, because she is pretty much blocking party finders from progressing on to the third fight. You know, you're going to end up going through maybe 5, 10, 15 more so party finders before you actually find a group that is capable of defeating Voidwalker. That's because Voidwalker takes the second fight approach in testing personal responsibility and kind of tunes it to a level we don't see very often with the second fight. The only other real second fight I guess block that we've had since the creator difficulty is probably Midgardsormr in the Alphascape raid tier. There was a lot of personal responsibility, positioning that needs to be mastered, and if it's not, it just gradually starts to snowball out of control. And at the same time, this group coordination that needs to exist, because while you can kind of drag people through it, you're not going to win if you're just dragging people through it. You might make it one step further, but you're not going to win. And that's key with Voidwalker here, because there's tons of mechanics where players technically interact with each other, but they don't necessarily need to be responsible for one another. Their own personal responsibility and placement matters for the overall success of the group, but is not necessarily detrimental to others' individual experiences. A big example with this is all the ads that get spawned. You know, I call them Zubats in the guide, but the Nixes constantly fly in, and when they touch people, 50% less damage for 30 seconds. Yeah, you're thinking, oh, well, I'm not dead, so that's not that bad, but that adds up, and a lot of people get hit by it in the party finder especially, and even in statics, you know, they can be really, really annoying to avoid. That's just the truth of the matter. But being personally responsible for learning how to avoid them is something that is kind of key to raiding, because at least when you screw up in Voidwalker, most of the time it's not going to mean the end of the world for the whole party. You know, maybe you drop a flare too close to the group and it kills everyone. Yes, of course, your own personal responsibility got other people killed. But more often than not, it's, I didn't step out of this AoE. I didn't remember to use knockback prevention. I died. I got hit by one of these ads. Now I have this damage down. I got hit by this other mechanic. I have vulnerability up. Maybe I missed a punishing raid puddle. Now everyone has vulnerability up, but we lived and we get to continue the fight. It just got a lot tougher. It's testing every individual to be responsible for their actions without immediately wiping the party. So you'll see those in rages a lot, because you can drag people through it. You just won't win. I think that Voidwalker checking for personal responsibility without always outright wiping the group is really important, because from this point on in the third and fourth fight, when you personally screw up, a lot of the time, it just kills the whole party. So if you can't do it here, when it's kind of isolated to a degree, it's only going to get worse. So once you've gotten past this encounter in Savage, in the party finder with people you don't know, or even with your static, you've suddenly hit a point where you can hit a stride, because now you all have the right mentality and the right performance of personal responsibility. And so you can approach the mechanics that will get your party members killed in the later encounters with a little bit more confidence. You know, you've proven yourself to some degree. And I hope that that ends up being something that is vital for people to have going into the third and fourth encounter, because you really need to be on the ball with your personal responsibility there, or the fight just ends kind of. As for the actual mechanics of E2 Savage, I think it hits a pretty nice note. It's all very familiar from normal mode. A lot of the stuff is the same from other stuff that's in the game. It's just about calculating when things are going to be hitting. Make sure your movements are smooth and you have assigned positions for certain things. You're paying attention to your surroundings. Am I going to get knocked off? Where is the fist actually coming from? Am I going to get hit by this thing if I stand here? It just, you know, requires very basic knowledge and dance skills, but it's something that is adequately challenging. This is a great second encounter and a very notable step up from the first one. This is one of the only raid tiers we've ever had where it feels like there isn't a mountain between the second and third encounter, which is actually a big problem with Final Fantasy XIV raiding. Because there's only 4 bosses in these individual Savage raid tiers, you just regularly run into problems where a group might be able to beat the second fight, but then the third fight becomes this mountain that they need to climb comparatively. I don't think that happens here. I think as many times as you hit Voidwalkers in rage because people are getting hit by things, I don't think you'll ever hit the enrage on the third encounter in particular nearly as many times. So the third encounter in this raid tier, Leviathan, is one that I guess I kind of already hit on all the points that I really wanted to hit on when I was talking about Voidwalker. I constantly compared Voidwalker's personal responsibility and, only, I guess, defeating yourself most of the time. Compare that to Leviathan, where when you screw up, odds are you're taking the whole party down with you. There's a few places where that's not true, but more often than not, that ends up being the case with Leviathan. I even said when talking about Voidwalker that odds are you won't hit enrage on Leviathan as often, because once everyone's capable of getting to the final bit of mechanics on Leviathan, odds are you've got the DPS to beat the fight. So those points, since I've already spoken about those, I guess with Leviathan, my overall thoughts on the encounter is that they did a good job taking it from normal to savage. I really wasn't sure what they were going to do with Leviathan other than a few pretty obvious things. I had to use my imagination, and of course my imagination is way more masochistic than the reality of what a savage raid tier is. But I was really impressed with this fight. It's one that I think is adequately more difficult than the previous one, just in such a different way that Leviathan is still kind of like a breath of fresh air after Voidwalker. When you screw up, the feedback is immediate. You go in, you try to fix it. If you don't fix it, you go back. Voidwalker just feels like a constant truck through a bunch of random mistakes that all add up to a failure at the end. Whereas Leviathan has a much more concrete feedback loop, I think, with the player. And as such, as you progress through Mechanic 1, as you progress through Mechanic 2, the progression feels much more grounded and doesn't feel like it's as much up to, a split-second decision as opposed to just very carefully orchestrating what it is Leviathan wants you to do. And I think that's a good design dichotomy to have between E2 and E3, because it just makes it so that you just had all that struggle, and now you get to feel like you're just making progression. It kind of lifts your mood back up after Voidwalker. So it's hard for me to really find any more words or thoughts without just repeating myself with Leviathan. It's a really solid third fight. I think it's about equal to Halicarnassus in terms of other third encounters that we've had since the creator difficulty. And I think it's one that people will generally enjoy and find creative. I hope they do, at the very least, because this actually almost became my favorite fight of this raid tier. It was pretty close between this Voidwalker and the fourth encounter. And the fourth encounter, I'm still kind of torn about how I actually feel, but let's just go on to that so I can try and figure it out. So the fourth encounter is Titan, and I think Titan is a very fitting final challenge, not just because of people's memories of it from back in A Realm Reborn and from the Weapons Refrain in the last expansion, but because it's very different, and at the same time we recognize a lot of pieces of it. There's a lot of points where you're fighting, making very basic mistakes. You have to control your movement, where you're getting knocked back, how you're using your actual knockback prevention, where your mitigation is, where your healing is. It pretty much asks the player to coordinate all the most essential things in a raid tier or in a raid composition. And for a raid tier, that's like what raiding should be. You should have tools like damage prevention for the party, or shields for the party, or tank cooldowns, or healing cooldowns, or feints, or addles, or all of these things should be coordinated. And with Titan, especially when you're first progressing, coordinating those things is really, really important. Making use of things like tank invulnerabilities, knowing how to get as much uptime as possible without killing your neighbors. All of these things are just super important. And while a lot of people find that Titan starts really tough and then gradually declines in difficulty as you race against the DPS check, I find that the whole fight just kind of asks you to be 3 different ways at 3 different points. And it's a matter of how well the party receives those individual challenges and approaches them. So I think we need to kind of break Titan's discussion into all 3 of the phases for me to really get into depth about that. So the first phase for Titan is very reminiscent of Stormblood. So in Stormblood, we had what were called door bosses, where the final encounter was actually split into 2 encounters. We were given the boss that we experienced on normal mode, which absolutely happens here in the first phase, with a lot of mechanics we experience in normal mode, cranked up to 10 because it is the final encounter in the raid tier. And we have a very tight DPS check before going into a brand new phase with brand new visuals, music, whatever it is. And we kind of have all that here. The first phase is very much Titan from normal. He has the same 2 Geocrush patterns, but they're very much treated in the Savage way. Removed AoE markers, instant cast times, new mechanics thrown in at the same time, checking your positioning, your uptime. It really wants to put as much strain on the player as possible in that really, really short first part to prove you're worthy to beat the rest of the fight. That's always kind of the big thing with door bosses, is if you can beat those, you have proven you are good enough to beat the rest of the fight. And it's something that people should take solace in, because it means once you get past that first phase, you're not in the clear, but you've proven it. It's kind of like Voidwalker going to Leviathan. You've proven that you can do it, because now the mechanics are a little bit easier to swallow, but it's a much longer period of time you have to do them in. So for Titan's first phase, overall, it gets a big thumbs up from me. It's one of the best first phases versus door bosses that we've ever had in this game. And I hope to see this be a similar trend, not necessarily for the whole encounter, but a similar trend of first phases where they very much are about rapidly testing the player and their understanding of normal mode versus recognizing new mechanics, because it's very, very exhilarating, this first phase. And I think that's going to be the phase that almost everybody looks back to and goes, wow, that part was really tough. And every time you beat it, you feel pretty good knowing that the odds of you making it at least farther into the fight, it looks a lot better. Now then we take Titan's second phase, which I'd say is not necessarily much easier than the first phase, but certain things are kind of removed from the group. You know, not having to worry about the boss's positioning is such a major thing to remove from player skill that, you know, having an entire phase where that whole prospect is lost entirely. Anytime you don't have to worry about a boss's positioning, they put themselves, and this was true for Leviathan as well, it adds, or actually just removes an entire skill set from the player. Voidwalker, actually, going back to that, the boss placement there is so crucial to people feeling comfortable doing mechanics, whether it be cleaver or the puddles, whatever. It's such an important part. The second phase takes that away in favor of giving you, more new mechanics, more knockbacks, more stuff you haven't seen, and more stuff you need to learn without any previous experience. First phase, you somewhat knew how Geo Crusher was going to work. You somewhat knew that Stone Crusher was going to be different. And there was, of course, going to be more damage or less AoE markers. But for the second phase, you don't know anything. You might recognize some things from the first phase, but every new mechanic is a new hurdle that you have to look at, approach, and overcome, even if it's not as fast-paced or tough as it was in the first phase. Now, the second phase of Titan very much resembles Leviathan in that you'll be given very particular debuffs, you'll be given very particular positions in which those debuffs will work, and your goal is to identify who gets targeted by them and where they need to stand. That's all it is, and then mix that in with the basics of mitigation, whether it be reprisals or, where you're actually standing or TBNs or whatever it is. The mitigation and healing that needs to come out is key here, but making sure people know where to go to not kill everyone they're supposed to be standing with, definitely the prime thing you need to do here. So Leviathan very much prepares you for the second phase of Titan, and for that reason, it's fun to do. It's fun to figure out. It's fun to see who needs to go low, who needs to go onto the elevated platforms, watching the plate fractures, breaking out the jails. There's a lot of instant gratification, again, to doing something correctly and the progression that you'll make on a pull-to-pull basis. So again, Titan, I think they nailed it with the second phase. I don't really have much to criticize. I don't really have much to add when talking about that. Now, it's the third phase where I feel like a lot of the discussion is actually being had, because the third phase of Titan takes some of the elements of phase 1 and some of the elements in phase 2 and makes you do them simultaneously. Now, this means that you suddenly have boss positioning to be concerned about, even though you have this giant boss in the background. It's very similar to Alexander Prime back in Creator, where he has a small one and the big one. It also has, mechanics from both the phases, so you need to recognize what the guy in the back is doing, what Big Titan's doing. And you also need to see how that checks against what the Little Titan is doing. There is a new mechanic with the rotating aftershocks, which is a new take on the way the aftershocks worked in the first phase. Earthen Fury becomes more like normal mode, but with Savage mode damage tied to the dot that comes with it. But the big thing here is that they shift from being an incredibly intense mechanical check like the first and second phases are, and making it more about finishing the fight. Like, it feels like it's all of Titan's power against all of your power. This is very similar to the design of Ultimate and the weapons refrain in particular for me, where the last 50% is here's very few mechanics, do them right, do as much DPS as possible, and you should be fine. And that's not really a bad thing to have, because sometimes at the end of a marathon, you're just out of breath. And even though the mechanics here are harder, we're talking about an over 13-minute encounter. And that can really wear on people when they have to have this perfect performance this entire time. So I think that they play the length of the fight versus what they're asking you to do at the very end. When the tension is up, when people are thinking, I can't screw up here, give them something simple. And you know what? people are still going to screw it up. It doesn't matter how easy it looks when you do it correctly. It matters how you feel the first time you're going through it. And the first time you make it to that final phase, and everyone's been telling you the phase isn't really that difficult mechanically, and you're learning it and you're getting through it pull by pull, further and further, people are screwing up less. And suddenly at the end of the fight, you go, yeah, that last phase really wasn't so bad. But there's still this tension every pull when you're doing that last little part, because you're in the home stretch. And it doesn't matter if it looks easier, it doesn't feel easier while you're doing it for the first time. And I think that tension is really what the last phase here gets correct, because the mechanics are not super hard. There's a lot of healing, there's a lot of mitigation that needs to be planned out here, whether it be the voice of the land, the tumults, the earthen furies, making sure that you're properly topped up for yellow markers, orange markers, making sure you're positioned right for blue markers, tank busters, triple tank busters, split tank busters. There's plenty of things happening here, and you do not have a lot of time to learn them or do them, because when you screw up, you got to go through another 10 minutes before you'll actually see this phase again. And I feel like that gets kind of underplayed a little bit here. I really find the last phase of Titan to be genuinely the right decision to have made. Now, I'm someone who wishes they went ham. Like, there were mechanics everywhere, but I always want that. I want that in every phase. I want the finale to feel like, oh my goodness, I don't even know what's happening right now. But I respect the decision making with this design as well, because it still asks people to be good at something. It just asks them to be good in a different way. And I think that's the biggest thing when it comes to rating. And that's been kind of my lesson this entire time, as my cat comes in here to meow mid-recording, and I'll leave that in, is that preparing you for as many different scenarios is what rating should be doing. Because that way, when you've experienced your first raid tier and you go into the next one, you can see those situations and recognize them immediately. Even if you can't figure out the mechanics right away, you can still recognize what kind of phase it is: a burst phase, a healing phase, a mechanical check. And once you can recognize those, raid tiers and raid perspective changes entirely. So for people seeing this, experiencing it for the first time, take in what this phase is trying to teach you and use that in every raid tier you do from now on. Value your mitigation, value your healing, value your OGCDs, and value your uptime and DPS, because that's what this last phase wants to make sure that you knew how to do. As for where I would rank Titan against other final bosses, it's actually kind of tough, because in a lot of ways, it's like 3 different fights. You know, yeah, the last phase is a mix of phases 1 and 2. Phases 1 and 2 are almost entirely different encounters, which is very much in line with Stormblood, you know, the door boss versus the actual boss. And I'm glad they went with this. I'm glad they went with the super long 13-minute encounter instead of door boss versus second boss, because there were just some things there that were just annoying to do week after week. It's nice to have everything kind of tied to a singular progression in a sense, without needing to reset it every single time. You know, you've been in there for 2 hours and you got to go back and beat another boss before you qualify for this one. So where would I compare it? I think kind of to Deltascape. I think my biggest thing here is the first 2 fights felt Alphascape level, which I think is perfect for first 2 fights. And the second 2 fights were kind of Deltascape level, where they're very much for people who are new to the expansion, but they're not easy. They're just, you know, they're very, not even scripted. It's not the word I'm looking for, because all the fights are scripted. They're just asking you to be good in a very particular way. And I feel like that was something Deltascape did really well and was undervalued in the 3rd and 4th encounters there. I also think the scale of the encounters, the way they appear, the way that they function, also is very similar to X-Death and Neo X-Death back in Deltascape. So overall, this gets big points for me. It's hard for me to say this is anything but one of my favorites. I actually still think Creator itself was probably the best exemplification of the Creator difficulty, as they've called it. But it's been a long time, and you know, how I remember it may not be how it actually was. So especially because I didn't really go hardcore in that raid tier. So it's hard for me to label it exactly, but overall, big fan of this raid tier. Really glad they went with this, and I think it's a good sign of things to come. I'm actually really excited for Ultimate, while it's on a whole nother level from Savage. They've shown some propensity for some new ideas here. Using elevation, you know, the way that they actually transition between phases and how they approach that. And I want to see what lessons they take into Ultimate and New Savage, and even just new content in general, because don't be surprised if you start seeing certain things that you see in the Savage pop up in easier content overall. So it gets you familiar with the ideas, just not at the same pace. Anyway, let me know what your thoughts were on the Savage raid tier. If someone who's just been seeing it from the outside, you know, let me know what it's like from a viewer standpoint. If you're someone who's gone through the raid tier, have your thoughts on the various fights, post them in the comment section below. This is a discussion. This is a place for you to share your opinion, and hopefully you guys feel comfortable doing that. But anyway, that's going to be a wrap for this video. As I expected, dragged on pretty long, but what can I say? And with that, I'm going to go grab dinner, and I'll see all of you in the next video. So thanks for watching, and until next time, take care.